Not far from my house in East Alton, Illinois, there's a historical marker to an almost forgotten part of local history. The marker commemorates a stockyard that existed in East Alton for only a few years. There's lots of stockyards in America, but this one served a special purpose. And the marker commemorates nearly 8 million casualties of one of the most destructive wars in human history. The East Alton stockyards were an important way and transport station for horses being sent on a perilous journey to the Great War, and they deserve to be remembered.
Correspondent Christian Thorsberg wrote in a 2024 edition of Smithsonian Magazine: "The domestication of horses is arguably among the most important achievements by early humans, allowing for massive advancements in travel, hunting, and combat." The point of the article, entitled "When Did Humans Domesticate Horses?" is to note new genetic research that suggests that horses were domesticated more recently than previously assumed, around 2200 BC. Smithsonian quotes Dr. William Taylor of the University of Colorado that the new finding is potentially a difficult pill to swallow for a lot in the science community. However, it still means that the relationship between humans and horses is more than 4 millennia old. Another part of the findings is how humans have changed horses, notably shortening the time between generations. Thorsberg writes, archaeologists noted mating between closely related horses and a reduced length of time between generations, from about 7 years to 4 years. Generations could have gotten shorter because horses had a higher survival rate in human care. Horses reproduced in safer, more stable environments, as opposed to the open plains, where birthing foals was more dangerous and left them exposed to predators. And they were likely made to mate at younger ages. This shows the importance of horses to humans, who literally changed conditions of horse reproduction in order to make more of them. However, the idea that the human relationship made horses safe has a caveat. Almost as soon as we figured out how to ride, we took horses with us to the most dangerous of pursuits: war. Science reporter Dr. Jonna Kanubi explained in a 1999 edition of the Australian radio program The Science Show that horses are the animal that, more than any other, has decided the fate of nations. Communication and transport weren't the only areas revolutionized by the horse. Horses transformed the way we made war. Horses first pulled chariots, and then they were used to carry warriors into battle. Alexander's companion cavalry won against the odds at Gaugamela. Horses allowed the Mongols to create the world's largest contiguous empire. The use of horses by the Spanish is credited with allowing them to overcome much greater numbers and conquer the Inca in Peru. The Polish winged hussars were among the most feared warriors in Europe for centuries. But horses served war in many other ways. They carried or pulled supplies, ambulances, and artillery. Quizzically, their role actually grew as humanity moved into the industrial age. An estimated 1.5 million horses and mules died during the American Civil War, more than double the estimated 650,000 human military casualties. That odd effect was perhaps most perplexing in the Great War. The First World War was the first major war to be fought in the era of motor vehicles, as well as one in which the technology of war, artillery, machine guns, poison gas, would seem to have made horses more vulnerable and thus less valuable to the vast armies of the war. In fact, Nancy Kramer of the University of Kansas School of Veterinary Medicine notes Great Britain and France discovered quickly in 1914 that frontal cavalry charges amounted to a slaughter of both riders and horses. Subsequently, cavalry charges were few. But that doesn't mean that horses were no longer critical to the war effort. In his 2013 book, There's Not to Reason Why, Horsing the British Army, Graham Whitten writes that while cavalry continued to be employed, every branch of service required equines. A cavalry division included 9,815 troop horses, chargers, and draft animals. Each infantry division needed at least 5,800 animals, not just the pack mules and light draft horses of the infantry battalions themselves, but also the divisional artillery, ammunition columns, supply trains, field ambulances, and signal companies. The Royal Artillery, the Royal Engineers, the Machine Gun Corps, labor and pioneer battalions, timber companies, all depended on horses. Even the Royal Flying Corps and the Tank Corps used them. The U.S. National Army Museum explains a war horse is often thought of as a huge cavalry charger or a smart officer's mount, but during the First World War, horses' roles were much more varied. Their contribution included carrying and pulling supplies, ammunition, artillery, and even the wounded. Without these hard-working animals, the army could not have functioned. Brooke, an international charity for the protection of horses, explains military vehicles were relatively new inventions at the time and prone to faults, so horses and mules were seen as more reliable and accessible form of transport. Thousands of horses were used to pull field guns, and with 6 to 12 horses required to pull each gun, exhaustion became a major obstacle. Britain did have a plan, the United States World War I Centennial Commission explains. British war plans for obtaining horses at the outbreak of the war had been based on a system of annual payments to horse owners who had agreed to maintain horses fit for military service that could be provided within days at a set price if needed. The call up of these animals was referred to as impressment, and it worked as planned, except for the fact that no plans had ever foreseen the scale of the war that unfolded in 1914. Within weeks after the war started, all the horses that were available in England and Ireland for impressment had been turned over to the army, and everyone could see that far more were going to be needed very soon. Clearly, the Western Allies needed more horses to support their growing armies. Brooke notes that at the outbreak of the war, the British Army had only 25,000 horses at their disposal. To meet their needs, Europe would have to look across the pond. While the total working horse population in Britain was estimated at about 2.6 million, the estimated population in the United States was some 30 million. The American Battle Monuments Commission explains, but when the war began, the equine reserves in Europe were not large enough to support massive armies. France, England, and Germany had to rely on other nations and non-traditional military equine to shore up their numbers of horses, donkeys, and mules for use in this global conflict. By fall 1914, hundreds of British and French purchasing agents and their staffs arrived in the United States and spread out across the continent. The process of collecting horses was complex. The United States World War I Centennial Commission writes that the British felt that for political reasons, their buying operation should be headquartered in the British Commonwealth country of Canada. But it was well understood that Canada did not have nearly enough animals to meet the need, and that most of the purchases would actually come from the United States. This was not a new experience for the British. The Centennial Commission writes that the demand for army horses had never been a significant part of the overall horse industry in Great Britain, and if there was a large and sudden increase in army needs, the domestic market could not support it. At least once before, during the Boer War, the British had supplemented their domestic supply with overseas purchases, largely from America. This is what led to the nearly immediate purchase of American animals, purchases which eventually reached the hundreds of thousands. As those purchases had only occurred just over a decade earlier, the Commission writes that it was not hard to restart the procurement process. The Monuments Commission writes that they selected animals based on size, breed, and type from specific regions. They established vast networks that evaluated and shipped the hundreds of thousands of horses needed. The British standards for cavalry horses were high, higher than the standards of the American Army, but they weren't, for the most part, seeking cavalry horses. The Centennial Commission notes that ideally they would be of a stocky build and not overly tall, since most of these animals were being bought as draft animals, not as riding horses. The vast majority of horses and mules bought and sent to France or other fronts were draft-type animals, plus some pack mules. This requirement valued health over training. The Centennial Commission explains that it was not necessary for the animals to be well trained. In fact, many were hardly what would be called green broke. They could not have any physical issues that would lead to early breakdown, such as crooked legs, swollen joints, deformed hooves, eye problems, or evidence of chronic disease. France, on the other hand, was looking for cavalry mounts, and they felt that the best place to get them was the U.S. state best known for its horses. The Danville, Kentucky Advocate Messenger reported on January 22, 1915, that the French government has decided to mount its cavalry on horses from the bluegrass exclusively. It was revealed that R.F. Carman, one of the best-known turfmen in the country, left for Lexington and Louisville, Kentucky, with an order in his pocket for the purchase of 60,000 remounts for the French government. This is but the initial order, and Carman states that he's going to buy all the horses that he can get a hold of. While Kentucky seems an obvious choice, it wasn't the only place to find horses in the United States. Most working horses and breeding in the U.S. was in the heartland, the Centennial Commission explains. The Midwest breadbasket of the country, and home to millions of acres under cultivation, became the supply hub for horses and mules. Lathrop, Missouri became the center for British purchases because it was the headquarters of Guyton and Harrington, the company that had the exclusive contract to supply British purchasing needs. It had a network of subcontractors in Kansas, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Oklahoma, Texas, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, Maryland, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. The animals that came from west of Missouri generally shipped through Lathrop, while those that originated further east were shipped through a network of depots to the embarkation points on the East Coast. Shipping that many horses required facilities. The Centennial Commission explains by November 1st, 1914, less than 60 days after England entered the war, purchasing offices for the British remount service were located in Kansas City, Denver, St. Louis, Chicago, and Fort Worth, as well as Toronto, and 6 major dealers, associate dealers, were involved. Within a few months, the process expanded to multiple other states and twice as many dealers. The animals were assembled in the dealers' yards, shipped in and out by rail using either existing stockyards or, in some cases, newly built facilities. One of those new facilities was in East Alton, Illinois, on the east bank of the Mississippi River. The Alton Telegraph reports that in January 1915, a remount station for the French and British governments was established on the Bowman property east of East Alton along the McIntosh Farm that would encompass approximately 330 acres for the feeding and caring of over 220,000 horses and mules, which were eventually processed on their way to World War I battlefields. Trains with 20 to 50 cars holding 40 horses each arrived and departed on a recurring schedule for the next 3 years. The station was quite large, taking up most of the modern town of East Alton. The East St. Louis news website riverbender.com writes that war horses were housed in East Alton and transferred out in World War I. They were housed somewhere in the area where Rand Pretter Park was, and they went all the way past where the East Alton Library is, and it was a huge area where these horses were stored. East Alton was chosen, the Telegraph writes, for 2 reasons. First, as a staging area for animals purchased in East St. Louis, and second, as a rest stop for stock traveling across country. Federal law stated that animals could not travel more than 36 hours without a break for feed, water, and rest. The station was well located and became a favored station. In 1915, the Telegraph wrote that one of the officials at the Bowman Stock Farm in East Alton, where horses are being kept for the French and English governments, said that the East Alton station was one of the best of a large number of stock stations over the United States. British and French agents were represented at the yard and weeded out horses that they didn't think were fit. Those, the Telegraph explains, were usually sold to local farmers. Remount stations like East Alton Stockyard offered, however, a risk of disease. The Centennial Commission writes that vast numbers of animals were held in pens, awaiting transport to the next stage of their journey, a remount station somewhere between the point of purchase and the East Coast. It was in these pens that they had their first opportunity for infection with one of the several respiratory diseases that plagued the shipping process. Equine influenza, generic pleuropneumonia, chest infections referred to as shipping fever, and strangles were the most common ailments. The first 2 were not generally fatal, but caused significant debility. Sick and injured horses were treated at a hospital in town, but the Telegraph writes it was finally moved to the far east end of the property after residents complained of flies. At one time, dead horses were thrown into the woods, but again complaints led to the building of a rendering plant where the carcasses were destroyed. The flies, though, were worth it, as the stockyard and horse sales represented an economic boon. The Centennial Commission writes that just as in England, military needs were not a big driver for horse and mule production in the huge horse market in the United States. The dollars that the British and U.S. remount services paid were, however, certainly welcome. Bill Furry, executive director of the Illinois State Historical Society, told the Telegraph, "It's a sad, sad story, but it was an industry that had a lot of economic value in the community." There were so many animals that a Midwestern thunderstorm in June of 1915 caused an unexpected problem. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat explains, residents of East Alton, Wood River, and Benbow City awoke yesterday morning to find that their backyards had been temporarily converted into stables, and that horses were nibbling the grass on their front lawns, nipping the leaves of their shade trees, and poking their heads through kitchen windows looking for hay. The equine invasion of the 3 towns was due to a stampede of 5,000 horses purchased in East St. Louis for the British and French governments, which broke out of a corral in which they were kept at East Alton last night during the thunderstorm. Rainstorms are common in southern Illinois, although 5,000 horse stampedes were more of a rarity. Most of the animals were recovered, although tragically 16 were killed on the railroad tracks. From East Alton, horses were shipped by rail to the coast and then to Europe. The Battle Monuments Commission writes that ships were modified with stalls and fodder storage. The Centennial Commission writes that with the war being fought in Europe, it was natural to ship all animals from the East Coast. Early in the war, the British purchasers did ship from Canada for a few months, but as the winter of 1914-15 closed in, the Canadian ports iced over, and all shipping from that time onward was done from the United States. At sea, of course, they faced a new risk. Richard Howe quoted U-boat commander Adolf Spiegel in his 1983 book, The Great War at Sea. The steamer appeared to be close to us and looked colossal. I saw the captain walking on his bridge, a small whistle in his mouth. I saw the crew clearing the deck forward, and I saw with a surprise and a slight shudder long rows of wooden partitions right along all the decks, from which gleamed the shining black and brown backs of horses. Oh, heavens, horses! What a pity, those lovely beasts! But it cannot be helped, I went on thinking. War is war, and every horse the fewer on the Western Front is a reduction of England's fighting power. Still, Winton reports that of the 703,705 animals shipped from the Atlantic ports during the entire war, only 13,724 were lost at sea. Of these, only about half were lost to enemy action, either shellfire or sinking, with the rest lost due to illness, onboard fires, storms, and other non-battle sinkings. In an irony, by the time the U.S. entered the war, they had difficulty finding mounts. The Battle Monuments Commission explains that the U-boat threat and the urgent demand for transport for soldiers, as well as an equine epizootic in 1917, means that the United States, which had provided so many animals early in the war, faced a shortage and had to purchase theirs in France, England, and neutral Spain. Some of the shortage was made up for with motor vehicles, but the Battle Monuments Commission notes that the American Expeditionary Force was still suffering a shortage of 163,000 equines at war's end. Life was, of course, not easy for a horse at war. Estimates are that a horse lasted an average of 30 days once they reached the battlefield. Some 8 million horses are estimated to have died in the conflict, with British statistics suggesting that about a quarter died from battle injuries and the rest, despite veterinary care, from illness, injury, and exhaustion. The Battle Monuments Commission writes, while the horse as a casualty of war is not uniformly recorded, their role in service proved critical to the success of the Allies.
An estimated 250,000 horses went through East Alton during the First World War on their way to the European battlefields, but the stockyards were dismantled almost as soon as the war was over, and East Alton's role in the First World War was promptly forgotten. Judy Ritchie of the East Alton Historical Museum told the Telegraph that while doing research for a local history book, she found out that these horses were veterans who had not been honored. The World War I War Horses in East Alton Monument was dedicated in 2022.
The War Horses of World War I historical marker was funded in part by the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. If you love history, you'll appreciate the work of the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, which is committed to supporting the celebration and preservation of community history. Since 2005, the foundation has funded more than 2,600 historical markers across the United States, all the way to Alaska. Some of these have been featured on the History Guy. And at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday, April 2nd, the Foundation is presenting an online special summit to celebrate National Historical Marker Weekend. And the featured speaker will be yours truly, the History Guy. Space is limited for this free half-hour virtual event, so sign up now using the link in the pinned comment. We'll see you there.
I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.